December 1941. The Eastern Front. The German Wehrmacht stands paralyzed across a front stretching over 1,500 miles. Temperatures plunge to 40 degrees below zero. Soldiers wrap their feet in newspaper and straw, desperately trying to prevent frostbite from claiming their toes, their fingers, their lives. Tank engines refuse to start. Lubricants freeze solid. Rifles jam. The oil in machine guns congeals into useless sludge. Supply lines collapse under the weight of an early Russian winter that arrived with biblical fury. In the forests outside Moscow, German corpses accumulate in grotesque frozen tableaus. Men who died standing up, their bodies locked in positions of agony, preserved by the merciless cold like sculptures in some macabre gallery of hubris. This is the nightmare Adolf Hitler created for himself. Operation Barbarossa, launched with supreme confidence in June 1941, promised a swift victory. The Nazi war machine would crush the Soviet Union in weeks, perhaps months at most. Hitler and his generals spoke of the Red Army as a house of cards, ready to collapse at the first blow. They were catastrophically wrong. By December, as winter transforms the Eastern Front into a frozen hell, the German advance grinds to a halt just miles from Moscow. The Blitzkrieg has failed. The Soviet Union has not collapsed. Instead, it has begun to strike back with unexpected ferocity. The rational calculation, the logical move for any leader facing such circumstances, would be defensive consolidation. Preserve what has been gained, shore up positions, wait for spring. Avoid any action that might open new fronts or invite new enemies into a war already spiraling beyond control. This is what conventional strategic thinking demands. This is what Hitler's own generals quietly suggest in their reports from the front. Instead, on December 11, 1941, just 4 days after Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, Adolf Hitler stands before the Reichstag and declares war on the United States of America. He does so voluntarily. No treaty obligation compels him. No attack against Germany has occurred. No immediate threat exists. America, though sympathetic to Britain and increasingly hostile to Nazi ambitions, remains technically neutral in the European war. Franklin Roosevelt, constrained by isolationist sentiment in Congress, cannot easily bring America into direct conflict with Germany without German provocation. Hitler provides that provocation willingly, even eagerly. He tears up any possibility of American neutrality and transforms a regional European conflict into a truly global war. He adds the world's largest industrial power, a nation with virtually unlimited resources, a population of over 130 million, and an economy that dwarfs Germany's, to the list of enemies he must defeat. He does this while his army freezes in Russia, while his oil reserves dwindle, while his forces are already overstretched across multiple fronts from North Africa to the Arctic Circle. The decision appears insane. Military strategists and historians have struggled for decades to comprehend its logic. Was it loyalty to his Japanese allies? Was it ideological obsession with confronting Jewish America? Was it a desperate gamble to regain strategic initiative? Or was it something darker? The decision of a man so consumed by his own mythology, so detached from reality, that he could no longer distinguish between propaganda and truth. To understand this moment, we must descend into the psychological architecture of Adolf Hitler in late 1941. We must examine how ideology, paranoia, and delusion intersected in a mind that genuinely believed Germany could fight the entire world simultaneously and win. We must trace the roots of a decision that would ultimately seal the Third Reich's fate, not in the frozen wastes of Russia, but in the combined industrial might of nations Hitler chose to unite against him. The declaration of war on America represents more than a tactical blunder. It reveals the fundamental nature of totalitarian thinking, the belief that willpower can overcome material reality, that narrative can substitute for strategy, that destiny favors the bold regardless of circumstances. Hitler did not stumble into war with America through miscalculation. He embraced it as confirmation of his worldview, as the inevitable confrontation his ideology always promised. But ideology, no matter how fervently believed, cannot warm frozen soldiers. It cannot manufacture oil that doesn't exist. It cannot conjure armies from thin air to fight on multiple fronts. December 1941 marks the moment when Hitler's delusions finally exceeded even Nazi Germany's formidable capacity for organized violence. The question is not whether this decision was rational, it plainly was not. The question is how a modern industrial state could be led by a man so thoroughly disconnected from strategic reality that he would declare war on a superpower while his army was literally freezing to death. This is the story of that decision and what it reveals about the mind that made it.
The ideology of inevitable confrontation. To comprehend Hitler's declaration of war on America, we must first understand that for Adolf Hitler, this was never truly a choice. It was an inevitability written into the core of his entire ideological framework. From the moment he began formulating his worldview in the beer halls of Munich in the 1920s, through the pages of Mein Kampf, to his secret speeches before inner circle associates, Hitler consistently articulated a vision of conflict that was racial, absolute, and global in scope. America was not merely another nation in this cosmology. It represented something far more threatening, the contaminated future, a mongrel civilization controlled by Jewish finance, a degenerate democracy that symbolized everything National Socialism existed to destroy. Hitler's anti-Semitism was not a political tool or cynical manipulation. It was the organizing principle of his entire understanding of history and power. He saw the world through a lens of perpetual racial struggle, where Jewish conspiracies manipulated nations like puppets on strings. In this paranoiac framework, the Soviet Union was merely Judeo-Bolshevism, a Jewish creation designed to enslave the Slavic masses. Britain and France had been corrupted by Jewish financial interests, and America was the ultimate Jewish stronghold, where mongrelization had progressed furthest, where racial purity had been most thoroughly abandoned, where Jewish power reached its apex. This wasn't rhetoric designed for mass consumption. This was what Hitler actually believed. In private conversations recorded by associates like Hermann Rauschning, and later by his secretaries during the war, Hitler returned obsessively to these themes. He spoke of Franklin Roosevelt not as a political adversary, but as a Jewish agent, personally conspiring to encircle and destroy Germany. He interpreted every American policy decision, Lend-Lease aid to Britain, the Atlantic Charter, Roosevelt's increasingly hostile rhetoric, as evidence of this conspiracy manifesting itself. The idea that American policy might reflect genuine moral opposition to fascism, or calculated national interest, or democratic values, was psychologically impossible for Hitler to accept. By late 1941, Hitler had already transformed the war into the racial apocalypse he always envisioned. The invasion of the Soviet Union wasn't merely a territorial conquest, it was a war of extermination, explicitly designed to annihilate Judeo-Bolshevism and claim Lebensraum for the Germanic race. The Einsatzgruppen death squads followed the Wehrmacht eastward, systematically murdering Jewish populations in occupied territories. The final solution was already in motion. The Wannsee Conference, which would formalize the bureaucratic mechanisms of industrial genocide, was scheduled for January 1942. Hitler had fully committed Germany to a struggle he understood in apocalyptic civilizational terms. In this context, America's increasing involvement in the war appeared to Hitler not as a potential danger to avoid it, but as confirmation of his entire worldview. Of course, Jewish America would eventually enter the war. The Jews controlled Roosevelt, and the Jews orchestrated the entire global conspiracy against Germany. The only question was timing. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Hitler saw not a complication requiring careful navigation, but an opportunity. Finally, the mask would be torn away. Finally, the true nature of the conflict, the racial war between the Germanic peoples and the Jewish-controlled democracies, would be revealed in its full clarity. Hitler's closest associates observed this psychological dynamic with varying degrees of comprehension. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, recorded in his diary Hitler's excitement after Pearl Harbor. The Führer, Goebbels noted, seemed almost euphoric. Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop attempted to counsel caution, suggesting that perhaps Germany should wait, should allow America to become bogged down in the Pacific, should avoid voluntarily expanding the war. Hitler dismissed these concerns with contempt. Caution was for the weak, for those who didn't understand the true nature of the struggle. The Tripartite Pact with Japan and Italy, signed in September 1940, did contain provisions for mutual defense if one signatory was attacked, but Japan had attacked America, not the other way around. Germany had no obligation to declare war. In fact, Japanese military leaders had not consulted Hitler before Pearl Harbor and had not expected Germany to immediately join the Pacific War. Hitler could have remained technically neutral, allowing America's attention and resources to focus on Japan while Germany consolidated its position in Europe. But this analysis assumes Hitler thought strategically in conventional terms. He did not. His grand strategy had always been ideological, not practical. He believed in the power of will, in the destiny of the Aryan race, in the inevitable victory of those bold enough to seize their fate. The material calculations that concerned his generals, industrial capacity, resource availability, demographic realities, were secondary to spiritual and racial factors. Germany would win because Germany was racially superior, because the Führer's will was unbreakable, because destiny favored the strong. Moreover, Hitler had convinced himself that America was fundamentally weak, a Jewish mongrel society lacking the racial cohesion and warrior spirit necessary for sustained conflict. He observed America's racial diversity and saw decay, not strength.
He noted the isolationist sentiment that had kept America out of the war for 2 years and interpreted it as cowardice, not democratic deliberation. He believed American soldiers, softened by materialism and democracy, would prove inferior to hardened German warriors on the battlefield. This catastrophic misreading of American power and resolve would have been impossible for any leader grounded in reality, but Hitler had long since departed the realm of rational strategic assessment. He inhabited an ideological fantasy where racial mythology substituted for intelligence analysis, where propaganda became epistemology, where the universe itself bent to National Socialist will. The decision to declare war on America, then, was not an aberration in Hitler's thinking. It was its purest expression. It was the moment when ideology completely consumed strategy, when delusion achieved total victory over reality.
The delusion of invincibility and the collapse of strategic reality. December 1941 represents a pivotal moment when Adolf Hitler's self-constructed mythology finally collided with the immovable reality of industrial warfare. For 2 years, that mythology had been continuously reinforced by an unbroken string of stunning military victories that seemed to validate every element of Nazi ideology. Poland crushed in weeks, Denmark and Norway seized, France, the victor of 1918, possessor of what many considered Europe's finest army, defeated in 6 weeks of blitzkrieg that left the world stunned. Yugoslavia and Greece conquered. Rommel's Afrika Korps driving British forces back across North Africa. The Wehrmacht had seemed genuinely invincible, a perfectly orchestrated instrument of violence that swept aside every opponent with contemptuous ease. These victories created a psychological feedback loop within the Nazi leadership, and especially within Hitler himself. Each success confirmed the Führer's genius, validated his intuition, proved that his will could overcome any material obstacle. When his generals expressed caution, Hitler overruled them and was proven right. When they warned against attacking France through the Ardennes, Hitler insisted and France fell. When they counseled against invading the Balkans before attacking Russia, Hitler ignored them and Yugoslavia collapsed in 11 days. The pattern became pathological. Hitler's instincts were infallible. Professional military expertise was timid and outdated. Boldness always triumphed. By the time Operation Barbarossa launched in June 1941, Hitler had developed an almost mystical belief in his own military judgment. He spoke openly of his somnambulistic certainty, a feeling that he walked through history guided by fate itself. His generals, the professional officers of the Wehrmacht, who understood logistics, supply lines, and the brutal mathematics of industrial war, increasingly found their assessments dismissed. Hitler didn't want to hear about oil shortages, about the impossibility of supplying armies across the vast Russian steppes, about the Red Army's numerical superiority, about the coming winter. These were the concerns of small minds, of men who lacked vision. The initial weeks of Barbarossa seemed to confirm Hitler's confidence once again. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed. Millions of Red Army soldiers became prisoners. German panzers advanced hundreds of miles, swallowing Soviet territory at a pace that suggested the campaign might indeed be over by autumn. Hitler's proclamation that the Soviet Union was a rotten structure ready to collapse appeared prophetic. In July 1941, mere weeks into the invasion, Hitler was already planning the victory parade in Moscow and discussing the post-war reorganization of conquered Soviet lands. But the Soviet Union did not collapse. The Red Army, despite catastrophic losses, continued fighting with a tenacity that shocked German commanders. Soviet factories, relocated beyond the Urals, continued producing tanks, artillery, and aircraft. The vast distances of Russia, distances German planners had intellectually understood but never truly comprehended, began to devour the Wehrmacht's mechanized units. Supply lines stretched to the breaking point. The autumn rains turned Russian roads into impassable mud that swallowed vehicles whole. And then came the winter. By early December 1941, the reality Hitler had refused to acknowledge could no longer be denied. The German army before Moscow was exhausted, undersupplied, and freezing. Frostbite casualties exceeded combat casualties in many units. The Blitzkrieg had definitively failed. For the first time in the war, German forces were not advancing, but desperately trying to hold positions against Soviet counterattacks. The mythology of invincibility had shattered against the frozen Russian earth. It was precisely at this moment of maximum vulnerability and strategic crisis that Hitler chose to declare war on America. The timing reveals the depth of his psychological disconnection. A rational leader, confronting the failure of his primary military gamble, would seek to minimize additional threats, to consolidate resources, to avoid expanding the conflict. Hitler did the opposite. He accelerated into the very confrontation his strategic situation most urgently demanded he avoid. What explains this?
Beyond ideology, beyond anti-Semitic paranoia, we must consider the psychology of the narcissistic authoritarian confronting the first real evidence that his mythology might be false. Hitler could not admit, perhaps even to himself, that Barbarossa was failing. To acknowledge this would be to acknowledge that his judgment had been catastrophically wrong, that his mystical certainty was delusion, that the professional military men he had overruled were correct. This was psychologically impossible. The alternative, the narrative Hitler constructed, was that Germany was not failing in Russia, but was instead engaged in the preliminary phase of a larger, inevitable global conflict. In this reframing, the struggle in Russia was not a disaster, but the opening campaign of a world historical confrontation between racial civilizations. America's entry into the war was not a devastating strategic blow, but the revealing of a conflict's true nature. Hitler was not a leader who had miscalculated and led his nation into catastrophe, but a visionary who understood that Germany's destiny required confronting all enemies simultaneously. This narrative preserved Hitler's self-image and ideological framework, even as it guaranteed Germany's destruction. The declaration of war on America also served another psychological function. It returned the initiative, at least symbolically, to Hitler. For months, he had been reacting to events, the unexpected Soviet resistance, the failure to capture Moscow, the winter crisis. By declaring war on America, Hitler made a dramatic gesture that appeared bold and decisive. It created the illusion of agency, of a leader in control of events rather than overwhelmed by them. That this gesture was strategically suicidal was irrelevant to its psychological purpose. Hitler's inner circle understood, at some level, the magnitude of what was happening. Goebbels wrote in his diary about the colossal nature of the struggle Germany now faced. Albert Speer, the armaments minister, later recalled the growing sense of doom among those close to Hitler who understood industrial capacity and resource constraints, but no one could effectively challenge the Führer. The system Hitler had created, a dictatorship built on personal loyalty, ideological fervor, and the suppression of dissent, had eliminated the mechanisms that might have produced course correction. Hitler had surrounded himself with sycophants, purged skeptics, and created a decision-making structure where his word was absolute and unchallengeable. The declaration of war on America was thus not merely one man's delusion, but the systemic failure of totalitarian governance. It demonstrated how authoritarian regimes, by eliminating checks on power and substituting ideology for analysis, become machines for transforming fantasy into policy. No council of advisors could overrule Hitler. No institutional mechanism existed to prevent catastrophic decisions. The entire apparatus of the Nazi state had become an extension of one man's increasingly detached psyche. By mid-December 1941, Germany was now formally at war with the Soviet Union, Britain, and the United States, three of the world's most powerful nations, collectively possessing overwhelming superiority in population, industrial capacity, and resources. Germany's allies, Italy, already struggling in North Africa and the Balkans, and Japan, now committed to the Pacific War, could provide little meaningful assistance in Europe. The strategic mathematics had become impossible. Germany could not win this war. The only question was how long the agony would last and how much destruction would occur before the inevitable end. Hitler had declared war on America because his ideology demanded it, because his psychology could not process defeat, because the totalitarian system he created could not stop him. The frozen German soldiers outside Moscow were the first casualties of this decision. They would not be the last.
The irreversible path to annihilation. The consequences of Hitler's declaration of war on America were not merely strategic, they were existential. In a single gesture of ideological compulsion, Hitler transformed a war Germany might conceivably have survived into one it could not possibly win. The mathematics were brutal and inescapable. In 1941, the United States produced more steel than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. American oil production dwarfed Axis capacity by orders of magnitude. The American economy, once fully mobilized for war, would outproduce the entire Axis alliance in virtually every category of military hardware: tanks, aircraft, ships, ammunition, vehicles. Germany's industrial base, already stretched thin across multiple fronts, would now face the accumulated productive power of the world's three largest economies working in concert toward its destruction. But Hitler did not think in these terms. He could not. To think strategically about industrial capacity, about resource allocation, about the long-term sustainability of military operations would require acknowledging material reality as the determining factor in modern warfare. Hitler's entire ideological framework rejected this premise. He believed, genuinely, fervently believed, that will triumphed over matter, that racial superiority overcame numerical disadvantage, that the spirit of the Aryan warrior would prevail against the soulless materialism of Jewish-controlled democracies. This was not cynical propaganda. This was the operating system of his mind. The declaration of war eliminated America's political constraints. Franklin Roosevelt, who had been navigating complex isolationist sentiment in Congress, who had been forced to support Britain and oppose Germany through indirect means like Lend-Lease, suddenly found himself freed from all political obstacles. Hitler had done what Roosevelt himself could not do, united the American public behind total war against Nazi Germany. The attack on Pearl Harbor had focused American rage on Japan, but Hitler's declaration ensured that Europe would remain the primary theater, that American industrial might would be directed toward crushing the Third Reich. Within weeks of the declaration, the implications began to manifest. The Arcadia Conference in Washington, attended by Churchill and Roosevelt, established the Germany First strategy. Despite Pearl Harbor, despite the Pacific War, the primary Anglo-American effort would focus on defeating Nazi Germany. American industrial mobilization accelerated to levels that would have seemed fantastical months earlier. Factories converted to military production on a scale never before witnessed in human history. Liberty ships began sliding from American shipyards at the rate of 3 per day. Boeing plants produced B-17 bombers in assembly line fashion. The arsenal of democracy, which Hitler dismissed as a nation of mongrels incapable of martial virtue, prepared to bury the Third Reich under an avalanche of steel, explosives, and industrial violence. On the Eastern Front, the German army struggled merely to survive the winter. The Soviet counteroffensive before Moscow, launched on December 5th, drove German forces back for the first time in the war. Units that had advanced to within sight of the Kremlin were pushed back dozens of miles. The myth of Wehrmacht invincibility died in the snow outside Moscow, and with it died any realistic hope of German victory in Russia. The Eastern Front would grind on for 3 more years, consuming men and material at rates that exceeded anything in military history, but the outcome was already determined. Germany could not defeat the Soviet Union, especially not while simultaneously fighting Britain and the emerging American Colossus. Hitler's response to these realities was to retreat deeper into ideology and fantasy. He dismissed generals who counseled strategic withdrawal, replacing them with officers who would follow orders without question. He issued stand-fast orders that forbade any retreat, condemning thousands of German soldiers to death or capture in hopeless positions. He spoke with increasing fervor about miracle weapons, jets, rockets, supertanks that would reverse Germany's fortunes through technological superiority. He pointed to Frederick the Great, who had faced overwhelming odds in the 7 Years' War, but was saved by the sudden death of a hostile monarch and the collapse of the coalition against Prussia. Hitler believed a similar miracle would save Germany, that fate would intervene, that the alliance against him would fracture. It would not. The Grand Alliance of the Soviet Union, Britain, and the United States, united by Hitler's own actions, held together despite profound ideological differences. Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt maintained their coalition through the crucible of war, coordinating strategy, sharing resources, and committing to Germany's unconditional surrender. Hitler had given them the enemy that bound them together. Every Nazi atrocity, every revelation of death camps and mass murder strengthened Allied resolve and eliminated any possibility of a negotiated peace. By 1943, the war had turned decisively. Stalin fell with an entire German army destroyed in the ruins. The Afrika Korps surrendered in Tunisia. Allied forces invaded Sicily and then mainland Italy. The strategic bombing campaign began systematically destroying German industrial capacity and urban infrastructure. The Atlantic Wall could not prevent the inevitable invasion of France. German oil supplies dwindled toward exhaustion. Synthetic fuel plants became priority targets for Allied bombers. The Wehrmacht, once the most formidable military force on Earth, was ground down through attrition it could not replace. Hitler's declaration of war on America had set in motion a chain of events that led inexorably to the bunker in Berlin, to the collapse of the 1,000-year Reich in 12 years of existence, to German cities reduced to rubble, to millions of German dead, to a nation partitioned and occupied. The decision made in that moment of ideological certainty in December 1941 guaranteed that Germany's defeat would be total, that no negotiated peace would be possible, that the war would continue until the Nazi state was completely annihilated. In the end, Hitler's declaration of war on America reveals the fundamental characteristic of totalitarian leadership operating in the grip of ideological delusion. It shows how systems built on the cult of personality, on the suppression of dissent, on the substitution of mythology for analysis, inevitably produce catastrophic decisions. It demonstrates that charisma, willpower, and ideological conviction cannot overcome the material realities of industrial warfare. It proves that nations led by men who believe their own propaganda, who surround themselves with yes-men, who interpret all information through the lens of paranoid ideology, will ultimately lead their peoples to destruction. The frozen German soldiers outside Moscow in December 1941 could not know that their Führer's decision to declare war on America had just sealed their fate and the fate of their nation. But history records the outcome with brutal clarity. Hitler declared war on America not despite his army freezing in Russia, but because the same ideological delusions that sent that army to Russia made confrontation with America seem not only inevitable but necessary. In doing so, he guaranteed that the Third Reich would end not in triumph but in absolute ruin,
consumed by the very forces his ideology claimed to master, destroyed by the material realities his mythology denied. The question was never whether Hitler would declare war on America. Given who he was, given what he believed, given the totalitarian system he commanded, the declaration was inevitable. The only question was when. And when that moment came in December 1941, with his army frozen and dying in the Russian winter, Hitler made the choice his ideology demanded, the choice that would ultimately destroy everything he claimed to be building. This is how dictatorships die, not through external force alone, but through the internal logic of their own delusions manifested in catastrophic decisions, from which there can be no return.